Non-Monogamy Help is a podcast where your questions about open, non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships are answered. Our host, Lola Phoenix, will consult a licensed therapist with over a decade of experience to address your problems. Names and locations have been changed or censored to keep your questions anonymous. You're listening to Non-Monogamy Help, the podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 40 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. I'm Lola Phoenix. Please send your questions to nonmonogamyhelp@gmail.com and they'll either be read on the podcast or the column anonymously. You're more than welcome to select which one you would prefer. If you would like to read the columns and listen to the podcasts, if you don't know already, you can go to nonmonogamyhelp.com. Subscribe to the newsletter by going to go.nonmonogamyhelp.com/email and follow us on Twitter at nonmonogamyhelp. If you want to support the columns and the podcast, you can become a patron. That's really, really helpful. Even $1 a month is just super helpful towards all of the daily runnings and everything that I'm phrasing this wonderfully. It helps. It shows a general vote of support for what I'm doing as well and just contributes towards the cost of running things. And you can do that by going to patreon.com/Lola Phoenix. If you donate $5 or more a month, your name, with your permission, will be read at the end of the podcast. Let's get to this week's discussion question. If this is the first time you're hearing an episode, every week before I read the letter, I put forth a discussion question that you can use with your friends, partners, metamors, anyone that you want to get to know a little bit better. I also answer it myself briefly to give you a little bit of context. This week's discussion question is: if a really kind person wanted to praise me, they'd say ... If a really tough person assessed me, they'd say ... So in terms of myself, if a really kind person wanted to praise me, they'd say, this is actually quite difficult for me because I think some of the things that I'm often complimented on can end up being not so great things for me. So I tend to be a very helpful person. I have an advice podcast, so that's kind of obvious. But sometimes I think that I'm a little bit too helpful, and that sometimes I think being helpful to someone will get me closer to them, or not. It's not like an exchange, but I tend to mistake utility for intimacy, if that's a better way to put it. So rather than, I do things for people because I want them to like me, which isn't necessarily a great thing to do, because sometimes people just appreciate that, but they don't necessarily feel any which way about you. And I sort of tend to think that appreciating that I've done something for them means that they like me, which they don't. So they would praise that, but I don't know if that's such a great thing to praise. But I do appreciate the fact that I'm generally helpful. I do think that's overall a good side of my personality. And then if a really tough person assessed me, they'd probably say what I just said, which is that, yeah, you're really helpful, but you need to be wary about who you help, because sometimes you help a lot of people and they take advantage of you, or you help people who don't actually want to give you as much help as you're giving them. So just be wary of that. So yeah, you can take this question and, take it to your friends, partners, whoever you want. And I'll say it again just so you have it, but it's also going to be in the podcast bio and everything else. If a really kind person wanted to praise me, they'd say ... If a really tough person assessed me, they'd say ... Awesome, let's get to this week's letter. I'm new to mono/polyam life. He's married and I thought we'd stay friends with benefits. I saw his marriage as a safeguard to either us catching serious feelings, my bad. Or I saw his marriage as a safeguard to either of us catching serious feelings, my bad. Now that we've started to know/care about each other, it's hard accepting that he loves me. I know it's wrong/insulting to assume that what we have is quote-unquote meaningless because he's married, and it would deeply hurt him to know I've been stuck thinking this way, or that I was fine with this being a throwaway type of thing. But it's hard to accept that I could matter to him too, or at all, especially because I spent so much time focusing on boundaries, jealousy, and so much other stuff to adapt to this. I'm embarrassed to admit that it never occurred to me that I could be more than a quote-unquote side chick fling, or that this was about romantic love at all. In my head, I know it's silly and ignorant to dismiss or invalidate any type of love, but my feelings haven't caught up. It would be nice to believe that we could have something special, but just thinking about it feels fake. I'm self-aware enough to realize that this is a really shitty view of polyamory and its meaning. I'm ashamed to admit that I just saw him as someone's leftovers who couldn't really love as many people as he thinks, and it sucks. What can I do to start seeing/accepting polyam love as real and valid? How can I work on changing my perspective so that I can respect/acknowledge his feelings even though I don't understand them? First thing that I want to say is that I think that you need to give yourself a little bit of a break, because this quite often happens to people new to polyamory. They read a lot about it, they investigate a lot about it, and then despite the fact that they know that they're coming from a culture where monogamy is the norm, where it's sort of socially reinforced and they have all these cultural scripts for monogamy, they somehow just expect themselves to be able to adapt to polyamory easily, without much of a fuss, and just magically, because polyamory seems like a good choice for them. But if you really think about it, I think that part of what your brain is trying to do is protect yourself, because you've grown up, unless you've grown up in a different society than I have, and apologies if that's the case, you've grown up in a society that has told you that monogamy is the norm, it is the socially acceptable way to express love, and that the only valid love is, when people are married to each other. So there is some type of protective instinct, I think, in your mind to go, I need to be really careful because I don't want to get my feelings hurt. Because, and in your defense, there are quite a lot of married polyamorous people, and you don't really say much about his history, like whether or not he's been polyamorous for a certain amount of years, whether or not he was polyamorous before he met his current wife. There are plenty of people who become polyamorous in their marriage and then decide to date someone else, and then it doesn't work out in the way that they think it should, and they dump that person, and that person gets really hurt. So I don't think that you protecting yourself a little bit is immature or necessarily a sign that you don't consider polyamory, the love that people have in polyamorous relationships, real and valid. I think it's just kind of a little bit of a natural self-protectant in the situation, and it makes a lot of sense. It's not silly and ignorant. I think you're just trying to be wary of it, and that's fair enough. I mean, you don't really say how long you've been with this person or how long he's been married to this other person, and there is a big imbalance here in terms of, the amount of time he's with this married person versus you, unless he met you a week after he met this married person. And even if that's the case, he's married to this person. There just is a natural power imbalance, and it makes perfect sense for you to try and be wary of that. I think that you need to give him a little bit more credit and just assuming his capacity for love. But I don't think that you just trying to protect yourself is necessarily, a sign of your immaturity or something ignorant or bad about yourself. I think that you need to kind of think about as well, what is real and valid love? Because the thing about growing up in a society where monogamy is the default and where marriage is kind of encouraged is that it creates what's known as the relationship escalator. And if you haven't heard of the concept of the relationship escalator, definitely Google it. It's basically a sort of cultural script that you get, which sort of says, right, you meet someone, you really like them, you go on a date, you date officially, you move in together, you get married, you have kids. It's a sort of like upper escalator of steps that you take in order to, in general, everyone's relationship isn't, people can fall in love with other people, things can happen. It's not as solid and secure as we'd like to think. However, this kind of escalator and this sort of script that you follow gives you the reassurance that your relationship is stable and that your love is valid. And so it's going to be really hard for you, because within polyamory, you kind of have to create a different kind of escalator. You have to create different types of meaning. You have to decide what commitment means. If commitment isn't being sexually exclusive to somebody, then what does it mean, and how do you define it, and what does it look like in your life? So you have come through a culture where real and valid love has been defined by marriage, and has been defined by sexual exclusivity, has been defined by monogamy. If they have children, then that's even more going to reinforce that concept for you. So you kind of have to break down the messages that you've received about what real and valid love means. And you kind of have to think, okay, what makes this type of their relationship more real and valid? Is it the marriage thing? Are there other things that you both can do that can create that kind of stability for you, or create that kind of, maybe after 5 years you decide you may not be able to legally marry multiple people, but you can certainly have as many marriage ceremonies as you want. You can certainly buy rings for each other. If that's the kind of way you want to express your commitment to one another, then you can do that. So just think about what real and valid love actually means to you. And I think that means that you'll be able to accept it. But it's going to be hard, and it's going to be a difficult egg to crack when you have an entire society surrounding you that says, it has to end in marriage, or, if somebody doesn't make it out of the relationship alive, then it's not a valid coupledom. So you have all of that to fight, and that's not easy. So give yourself a little bit of a break again. I think as well, one of the things that people joke about polyamory and about polyamorous people is that we sometimes over-communicate and communicate to an extent to which it becomes unhelpful. And I do think sometimes we overthink things. People in polyamorous situations are so worried about it working and are so aware of kind of I wouldn't say it's a dominant cultural narrative, because people are aware open relationships exist. I think they're sort of aware of it. I think that the sort of assumption that most people would have is that it doesn't work. Like, they would just assume that it doesn't work. And when we ask, well, what does work mean? We define working as, the people in that relationship being in that relationship until somebody in that relationship dies. And that's what working means. And even though I'm lax to sort of recommend Dan Savage in any way, shape, or form for a various amount of reasons, the aspect of the advice that he gives when he says that we need to stop defining relationship success as, only one person makes it out alive, I agree with that. I think that you are surrounded by a society which, in some ways, I wouldn't say completely dominantly says, but the idea is that open relationships don't work, non-monogamy doesn't work, polyamory doesn't work, and so you have to kind of fight against this, and that is really difficult and takes up a lot of your energy. And part of that, and trying to protect ourselves from that assumption that, it doesn't work, I need to make sure this works. And we judge ourselves so much based on that, and we judge our ability to do polyamory, judge that. We don't do that for monogamy. Comedians have made tons of money, beaucoup de money, on joking about how terrible marriage is and about how horrible monogamy is. Monogamous people are never expected to love monogamy. They're never expected to enjoy monogamy. However, there's a different standard that is kind of put upon the shoulders, and I think it's partially self-placed. We think that we need to enjoy non-monogamy all of the time in order for it to be a valid life choice, and so you're really, really put in this situation where you're like, hyper-examining everything because you're waiting for something to fail because you don't want it to fail, because you want everything to work because it has to work. And that creates a lot of tension where if you were monogamous, you wouldn't be worrying about half these things. So I think you need to think about how often you're thinking about this. Think about how much weight you're putting on this. Think about, would you be analyzing this so much if you were just dating him and the assumption would be that maybe you would end up being in a monogamous relationship, or maybe you wouldn't. So I think you need to, it's easy to say, don't worry so much, but really that's the advice. Think about how much you're picking this apart, and ask yourself if you really need to pick this apart so much. Is it really helping you? You're not going to be able to take out some kind of loveometer and measure what is real and valid love, and how much love do I have for this and that and the other. It's not something that's a measurable concept. So you just have to trust that, you care about this person and the relationship will go where it can go. I think if you do have the resources and it's accessible for you, I think finding a polyamory-friendly therapist would also be really helpful. But in general, I think to kind of sum up, remember that you don't have any models for this. You don't have any scripts for this. You don't have the relationship escalator. You don't have all of these messages about what real and valid love means, and examine that. I think don't be so hard on yourself because you're protecting yourself in this situation of saying, okay, maybe I need to not put all of my eggs in one basket. You're protecting yourself. So don't be so hard on yourself for protecting yourself. And then, last but not least, don't pick this apart to such a minute extent. You don't need to analyze this in such serious depth. Think about where you want your relationship to go, but you don't have to pick it apart so much that you're just analyzing and fretting over the details and am I accepting that this love is real and valid, and am I, really accepting this or not? I think that part of your inability to accept it is the fact that you're kind of hyper analyzing it. All right. Well, I think that's about it. I really hope this helps, and good luck. Thank you for listening to episode 40 of Non-Monogamy Help. If you want to be awesome, you can donate to our Patreon. Again, donating $5 or more a month means that your name with your permission will be read at the end of the podcast. This week's current patrons are Laura Boylan, Chris Albert Jones, Duke, and James Wartell. If for whatever reason you can't become a patron because life happens, and sorry for the background noise, then if you would like to take 5 minutes to log into iTunes to find the podcast and rate and review it, that would also be really helpful. A rating and a review helps more people find the podcast, and if you don't have any time to do a review or you feel awkward about it, a rating is also really, really good. So if you have 2 minutes or 5 minutes to spare, please do that if you can. That's all for this week. You will be getting a new column on the 21st of August, and then there's going to be a break for the week of the 28th, and then you'll get a new podcast on the 11th of September. Actually, there's going to be a column on the 4th of September when we come back, and then there won't be another podcast until the 11th of September. I may, on the week of the 28th, depending on my time and availability, release one of my articles, an audio version of one of my articles, depending on, as I said, my time and ability. So do keep an eye on nonmonogamyhelp.com for that, because I will also post it there, and I will also send it out to the newsletter, and of course send it to my patrons. So if you definitely want to be included in that, make sure that you are signed up to the newsletter or become a patron, or make sure you check the website over the coming weeks. Thank you so much, and yeah, that's it. You've been listening to Non-Monogamy Help. Our podcast music has been provided by Chris Albury Jones at albury-jones.com, and the art was made by Dom Young at domduong.com. Thank you for listening.